This happened to my brother-in-law 2 years ago. I'm telling the story exactly as he told it to me. He came off as completely honest and reliable when he recounted the events. And you know what? After everything I've been through, I have no reason to doubt it. Whether you believe it or not is up to you. He said he'd been in the British Army. My mother hated the life I'd chosen, and to be honest, I can't entirely blame her. But the worst and absolutely the most terrifying experience I've ever had wasn't in one of those horrific war zones in the Middle East. No, it happened right in the heart of civilization in London. Through returning from my 3rd overseas deployment, I received a medal from the Army. They even offered me a position as a guard in the Queen's Guard. I'm not sure how familiar you are with that gig, but it's a pretty big deal to be allowed to stand there, a huge honor if you will. Me? I hated it. I was permanently stationed at home as a reward for my so-called heroism. There I was, standing in front of a building like a statue, while a bunch of annoying Chinese tourists tried to make me laugh. I never wanted to be there, but the great honor of being offered the position, and the misguided thrill of facing danger only from a few tourists, made me feel I had no choice. Had I known, I'd have been safer hiding in some dank cable duct. I worked a few shifts a week at the Tower of London. They usually lasted 2 to 3 hours depending on how many people were on duty that day. I have to say, the job was boring as hell. Whether it was meddling people or obnoxious tourists who thought they were the first in the world to try and get a reaction out of me, sometimes I just wanted to get away. But it was a job and I got paid, so I shut my mouth and did what I was supposed to do. Then one day in 2012 started off as boring as any other. A group of young Frenchmen tried to mess with me, and there was nothing I could do unless they directly threatened me. Later, a few drunk Russian girls passed by, but they weren't nearly as bad. That day, the heat was so oppressive it felt as if my hat had melted onto my scalp. Out of nowhere, a group of tourists approached me. They looked like they were on a guided tour, and they started doing the usual, snapping photos beside me and making silly faces. Everyone had their cameras out, and they were all wearing matching t-shirts with some leg motif. Except for one woman. I noticed she was standing a little apart from the others, just staring at me. She was pretty, probably in her early 40s, with long, dark hair and extremely pale skin. I even assumed she was British since she was with the tour group. After the tourists had taken a ton of photos and realized I wasn't going to crack a smile, they all dispersed, everyone except the pale woman who kept staring. I'd seen my share of people doing weird things to provoke a reaction, but this was different. Not only that, but she just wouldn't stop. 2 hours later, and probably after 100 more tourists had come and gone, she was still standing exactly where she'd been, staring at me. The day was sweltering, and I thought there was no way standing there for so long could be comfortable. But I didn't think she was any calmer than I was. I assumed she was trying to get me to laugh. Then, about half an hour later, when nearly all the tourists had left, she slowly took a step toward me, then another. That's a bit odd, I thought. She took her time approaching until she stopped about half a meter in front of me and locked eyes with me. She tilted her head slowly from left to right. I figured she was still trying to be funny until I realized she wasn't joking at all. Still standing directly in front of me, she leaned in even more. There was something so strange and creepy about her that I began to feel genuinely nervous. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her, not for a single second. She kept leaning in, her face coming so close that it almost touched mine, and then her whole demeanor became unnaturally still. Suddenly, she started shaking, as if she'd just stepped out of a freezing cold shower. And then it happened. She opened her mouth as wide as humanly possible, as though she wanted to scream at the top of her lungs, but not a sound came out. She simply stood there, her open mouth only centimeters from my face, screaming silently in that unnatural way. The shaking intensified rapidly despite the heat, sending chills down my spine. Eventually, I managed to tear myself away from her gaze and stagger over to the guard post area. After taking my 10 steps, I stopped, closed my eyes, and prayed that the woman would vanish when I opened them again. But when I turned around, I nearly froze. She was right there, still leaning forward with her mouth agape and her head trembling uncontrollably. I was so shocked and scared that I couldn't even scream. I've had people scream in my face before, even an idiot who tried to pick a fight, but this silent, eerie behavior terrified me. "Clear the way for the Queen's Guard," I shouted, a phrase we're allowed to use if someone's blocking our path. The woman didn't budge. Instead, she leaned in even closer, within less than a centimeter of my face. I raised my voice even more. "Clear the way for the Queen's Guard." I hoped my voice wouldn't crack. Still nothing. "Madam, would you kindly move?" I ordered, seeing no other option than to take a step back and point my bayonet at her, the absolute last resort when you feel threatened. Then, as suddenly as before, she closed her mouth and leaned back as if resuming a normal gait. I didn't wait to see if she'd move any further. I just started walking past her. When I returned to my post, I stood as still as required, and to my great relief, she was nowhere in my peripheral vision. What a shitty job, I thought. I've got to find something else. Just then, I heard a whisper in my ear.
1098.
It had to be her. She was right behind me. Again, in a low, steady tone, 1098. My whole body broke out in goosebumps. It's ironic. A war veteran who's killed more in combat than he'd ever admit is now terrified of a tourist. The numbers kept coming faster.
1098, 1098, 1098.
Then she stepped right in front of me and whispered even more quickly. It was utterly surreal. She leaned in again, repeating the numbers over and over. I was on the verge of breaking down. I just couldn't take it any longer. Something was seriously wrong with her. I barely managed to choke out, "Madam, would you kindly," when suddenly a large group of tourists approached us. The strange woman leaned back while still staring at me, then moved away and slowly melted into the crowd. All that remained was an eerie, unsettling feeling and a gaggle of terrified Asian tourists. I've never been so relieved to see a Chinese man with a Nikon camera snapping pictures. Later that day, my boss cornered me. "Wait, you weren't talking to her, were you?" he demanded. "What do you mean?" I asked nervously. "Boy, you did talk to her, didn't you?" I didn't want to lose my job or my pay because of our strict no talking on duty rule, so I lied. "Absolutely not, sir," I replied. He looked relieved. "Good. If she ever comes back, you're not to speak with her again." The others in the room fell silent. I was surprised and mostly exhausted, so I decided to go home and get some sleep instead of complaining about those damn tourists. The following shifts passed normally, the same boring routine as always, and the woman was nowhere to be seen. Besides, my girlfriend was coming over from the Netherlands, and I almost forgot about the incident. Then, one Tuesday night around 3 a.m., I was startled awake by a loud knock on the door. For some reason, the first thought in my head was that it was the woman from that incident earlier in the week. "Could you check through the peephole to see who's outside?" I mumbled to my partner, who slept so soundly that nothing ever woke her. Half awake, I stumbled into the hallway and approached the front door. "Who is it?" I shouted through the door while peeking out. It was pitch dark, which only made me more alert. I repeated, "Who is it?" The only response was another loud knock. "Oh my God," I whispered and reluctantly opened the door. There, standing in the doorway, was the one person in the world I never expected to see, my girlfriend. I was supposed to have picked her up earlier that evening. I almost lost control of my legs as 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, trying to rationalize what was happening. "Thanks for picking me up at Heathrow, you idiot," she snapped irritably as she shoved her bag against my chest. I stood there speechless. "I travel all the way from Amsterdam just to see you, and you really forget about that?" I tried to protest, but I was still half asleep. Then I realized someone was already in my bed when I woke up that morning, a detail I hadn't even dreamed of. "Stay here." "What is it?" "Just wait a minute, stay here." I wasn't sure where this sudden burst of courage came from, but I cautiously made my way toward the bedroom. I know what you're thinking. In all the movies, the guy leaves and the room is empty, right? I wish it were that simple. When I entered the dark room, all I could hear was heavy, labored breathing so loud I thought I was about to faint when I finally switched on the light. Then I heard 765.
765.
From the far corner of the room, I saw her, again that cursed woman, standing silently against the wall. She stared fixedly in my direction. Though I thought I had lost the ability to speak, I managed to mumble, "What the hell?" She replied in that same eerie tone, 765, and took a step toward me. With each step, she mouthed the numbers 765 again and again. I couldn't move. It was as if nothing else in the world existed except for her slowly advancing presence. It was a horrible feeling. I wasn't physically afraid. I could probably handle her if I had to, but this wasn't about physical strength. It was a fear that gripped my very soul, as though I'd been haunted by her in my sleep. She came so close, leaning forward until she was only a centimeter from my face. My breathing grew ragged and loud, the only sound in that oppressive silence, and the numbers continued.
765.
Suddenly, a shout broke through. "What the hell?" I snapped back to reality. Turning around, I saw my girlfriend rushing toward me. I grabbed her and shouted, "You're done for," as we bolted out of the bedroom. We ran to the kitchen, and in a moment of panic, I seized a knife. She cried beside me but said nothing. Then I heard footsteps. I looked out the window and saw her walking calmly down the hall. Her gait was unnervingly measured. She wasn't looking directly at me anymore, but instead, her eyes were fixed on the ceiling. She didn't speak as she made her slow way toward the door. It was surreal. I couldn't believe that this was the same woman who had terrified me just a week ago in my own apartment at 3 a.m., and now, after what felt like hours, she was still there. My girlfriend couldn't find her voice to ask questions, and though we eventually began to recover from the shock, I was haunted by the fear that she might think I'd been unfaithful with the woman. Fortunately, that thought never crossed her mind. Later, after the incident, there were hushed whispers in the apartment, an almost unbearable dread of what that encounter had meant. I texted a colleague the next morning to ask if the boss was all right. He replied, "Yeah, why wouldn't he be?" All I really needed to know was that my time with the guard was over. The following day, I nervously approached my boss. "Sir, we need to talk," I said. I swear, his face went completely pale. He didn't even ask what was wrong. "Sit down," he ordered, leaning back in his chair. I struggled to admit that I'd broken the rules. "You spoke with her," he said, his tone accusatory. I tried to explain, but the words just wouldn't come. Then he continued, "If she ever returns, you are not to speak with her again." "Holy hell, boy," he suddenly shouted, the first time I'd ever heard him swear. "Who is that woman?" he demanded. "I'm going to remove you from the guard immediately," he added, practically shooing me away as he rifled through his desk for something. I stuttered, "Sir," unable to believe that I was about to lose my job. "Don't worry," he finally said. "You'll find something else. But your time with the guard is over. You can expect a transfer within the week." I tried to protest, but I just wanted to, but he cut me off. I was furious, yet relieved at the same time. I still needed a steady monthly income rather than standing out in the street, ignoring tourists and lunatics. The new duty rosters came out, and believe it or not, I was scheduled for only one shift the following week. That worked out perfectly, since my 7-year-old niece was coming to visit from Birmingham that weekend, and I'd already planned a ton of activities for us. Thursday came, and I noticed my girlfriend had finally started to relax after her return from Amsterdam. Life felt good again. I was scheduled to work from 6 to 10 p.m. in front of St. James's Palace. Usually 2 of us would share that shift, but for some reason I was assigned to work alone starting at 9. "Just 1 more hour and you're done, buddy," my colleague said a couple of minutes past 9 before marching off. I stood alone at my post. On the other side, it was 2 a.m., eerily quiet and still. Soon after, it began to rain. By 10:30, it was still raining, still calm, and still incredibly boring. Then, at 9:45, the rain grew heavier, so I decided to spend the last 15 minutes inside the guard post. I turned around, and I shouldn't have done that. There, in the dim light at the entrance of the post, stood her. If I were a writer, I'd have described in graphic detail how horrific she looked. But simply put, it was the most frightening sight I've ever seen, and I've witnessed a child killed by a landmine. She stood there in a white dress that almost glowed in the weak light. But her face, damn it, her face was what truly terrified me. She didn't speak directly to me, which made everything even more unsettling. Instead, she slowly raised her head, tilting it so far back that I could only see the lower half of her face. Her mouth was agape in a way that no ordinary human could manage. It was surreal. We were standing before someone who defied all rational behavior. When you're mugged, you know they want your money. When you're attacked, you know they're trying to kill you. But nothing compares to the terror of not knowing what you're facing or what this woman really wanted from you. At 9:49 p.m., just 11 minutes before I could finally leave, she took a step toward me. There was about half a meter between us. Then she stopped, leaned forward, and her head began to shake, first slowly, then faster and faster, as if shuddering from an unbearable cold. Her eyes were so wide and unnaturally fixed that I swear I saw blood at the corners of her mouth, the skin seeming to split. The silence around me was absolute, perhaps the quietest I'd ever experienced. 9:54, as if she'd heard my frantic thoughts, her pacing slowed and she fixed her gaze on me, really looked right through me. I nearly jumped back. I can hardly believe I'm saying this, but I desperately wished she'd keep her mouth open, the way it opened and closed repeatedly, as if she were biting something. Her teeth clacked together so hard I thought they might shatter. I couldn't take it any longer. I stepped back and screamed, "Stop, for God's sake, just stop!" And miraculously, she did. Her teeth ceased clacking. Her mouth closed and she leaned back into a normal posture. Then she stepped forward again and, for the first time, smiled. In a soft, eerie whisper, she repeated,
4321. 4321.
"What does that mean? What are you saying?" I yelled at her, my hand twitching as if I were about to grab her. I shook with anger and fear. Then, at 9:58, someone shouted from behind me, "What the hell?" It was my boss. He ran over and demanded if I had spoken with her. "For God's sake," he roared, grabbing my uniform without even looking at the woman. "Yes," I mumbled. "Damn. What number did she say?" he demanded in frustration as he released my uniform. I couldn't understand a word. What was the last number she said? Was it 0? No, I think she stopped at 1. I couldn't make sense of it. Even as she continued to stand there, still smiling, she walked between my boss and me. My boss ordered, "Just go." I couldn't just leave things as they were. I started to back away. I'm never coming back. I'm taking this with me, I thought bitterly. Normally, I consider myself brave and unflappable, but in that moment I wanted nothing more than to run away. I hope nobody blames me for that. Before I could get far, my boss called after me, "Never speak of this again." I know a lot of this sounds like bullshit. It really does, especially when I look back on it now. I could have arrested her. I could have killed her if I wanted to, and my boss could have done the same. When you find yourself in a situation as surreal and terrifying as that, you stop acting logically. I went home and took a long, cold shower after double-checking that all the doors and windows were locked. The next morning, I collapsed on my bed. I texted a colleague to ask if the boss was all right. He replied, "Yeah, why wouldn't he be?" That was all I needed to know. My time with the guard was over. On Friday, my niece arrived and was set to stay with me all weekend. Taking care of a 7-year-old can exhaust anyone, and it almost kept my mind completely off that dreadful encounter with the woman. I wasn't going back. I'd even received my transfer papers that very morning. I spent the whole Friday taking my niece to different places. Saturday morning, we had breakfast and watched cartoons. I put on Catwoman. We watched it all the way through, and I eventually dozed off on the sofa. Sometime later, my niece woke me up. "Uncle, come on, let's play with the walkie-talkie," she said excitedly. I'd always loved playing with those as a kid, so I couldn't really say no. "Sure," I replied, "let's see if they work. Maybe you can go outside so we can test if we can hear each other." I inserted the batteries and fiddled with the settings. "Okay, Catwoman, can you hear me?" Over. Then I heard a soft voice on the other end. Nonsense. But that wasn't Ashley's voice. It wasn't the playful nonsense I expected. "Ashley!" I shouted and ran outside, cursing myself for letting her wander alone. There, in the garden, she was clutching the walkie-talkie tightly. And standing right in front of her was that same woman, bent over as if looming over the little girl.
000.
The woman repeated over and over, her gaze fixed on my niece's terrified face. I lost it. This was my niece, no one was going to hurt her. I sprinted toward the woman and tackled her with such force I was sure I'd injure her. As soon as I hit the ground, I got up and scooped Ashley into my arms. "Are you okay?" I asked, not even noticing how tightly I was holding her. I was so busy being afraid I might have scared her even more. She sobbed and couldn't answer. "Let's go inside," I said, turning toward the woman. She was still on the ground, face pressed against the pavement. I peered out the window and saw her slowly getting to her feet, moving as if to call the police. "Don't be scared, little one, everything's going to be all right," I tried to reassure Ashley. I noticed that her cheek and the area around her nose were clearly injured, and she was limping, but it didn't seem to bother her much. I must admit, I almost froze in place. We stood together, staring out the window as the woman crept closer. Police were on their way. I saw her get right up to the window, but she no longer looked at me. Instead, her eyes fixed on Ashley. The poor little girl clung to me, squeezing my hand as tightly as she could. The woman edged even nearer. The glass was the only barrier between her and my niece. I was about to grab Ashley and run to another room, far away from that creature, when suddenly the woman opened her mouth. Then she closed it, almost as if smiling. She alternated between opening her mouth and smiling, and all I could see was the blinding white of her eyes. "Let's get out of here," I said, exhausted, as I lifted Ashley. The police arrived about 15 minutes later and began searching the neighborhood for the woman. They eventually found a woman who matched the description and arrested her for identification. They even had to take her to the train station first, apparently so her mother could be informed about what we had witnessed. I got on the train with my niece. A kind conductor kept an extra eye on her until we reached our destination and even took the time to show us all the fascinating parts of the train. Finally, as the train was about to depart, the conductor pointed us toward the little steps leading into the carriage and said with a smile, "We're leaving shortly. Tell your mom to call me when you get home." It was reassuring in a small way, though I was still trembling. An announcement came over the loudspeaker, and the conductor gently opened the door further and guided Ashley into the car. Then, as my niece and the conductor stepped inside, I heard that terrible voice again whisper,
1098.
I still don't know what to make of those numbers. Everything that happened that night still sounds utterly unreal to me. I've seen horrors on battlefields, but nothing compares to that inexplicable terror, the sensation of facing something utterly beyond rational understanding. Even now, whenever I think back on that night, I can't help but shudder.
That's it for tonight's tale. But don't worry, there's always more where that came from. Be sure to stay tuned for even more nerve-thrilling horror stories every single week. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join us here at the Hollow Horror. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Until then, stay safe. Or stay scared. See you next time.